I should start by saying it sounds like a terrific project that you've underway, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of my colleagues in the archive and knowing that this is going to be a permanent repository of the history of anthropology in Canada and in Quebec as well as in the other parts of Canada. So I should also say, by way of introduction, that 4 years ago, 5 years ago at the Montreal meetings of the AAA, I was asked to give a retrospective lecture, which I entitled A Little Joke, The Kung and I. It's a little play on words from the Rodgers and Hammerstein, the King and I, which is, about the Siam, the King of Siam. So the Kung and I was my little pun. And there I gave a lecture which I expanded into a memoir, which has been published in the Journal of Ethnoarchaeology. So I'm going to recount some of the moments that I put into that memoir. And so just to begin, when I was asked for this other project, well, how would you sort of define your formation as a human being, your personhood? I found three elements. I sort of identified three elements. First of all, I'm Jewish, and so the Jewish approach to life and the Jewish humor was a big part of my childhood. Second of all, I was raised in a family on the left, so we were very much a part of the left wing of both first the United States and then Canada. And then third of all, I grew at a very early age to have a deep love for the wilderness, for the outdoors. And so some of my most cherished memories are of going to camp and canoeing in northern Ontario in Muskoka, Haliburton, and Temagami. So those were my three sort of elements of my formation. I was born in New York City. My parents moved to Canada during the Second World War. I think we arrived in 1942 when I was 4 years old. And then, so my entire formation from that point was in Canada. And so by the time I was 18, and the US draft was on, I renounced my US citizenship and became a full-time Canadian for the next 60 plus years. And my childhood memories because we were on the left, my family, our Judaism was more secular than religious. And so one of my deepest memories was of a visit to Canada when I must have been 6 or 7 years old by Paul Robeson, the great actor, singer, political activist. And so he was a friend of the Jewish left, and one of his most stirring renditions that we sing annually at our secular service is the hymn of the Warsaw Ghetto Fighters, Zognet Kainmal, sung in flawless Yiddish by Paul Robeson. So these were the cherished memories of my childhood. And from the age of 8, my parents sent me off to camp, first in Haliburton, then later I spent several years in Temagami. And so I just became, I felt so fulfilled by being surrounded by wilderness and looking up at the sky without any city lights and seeing the incredible skyscape that you could see in Temagami, for example, that somewhere became deeply embedded in my persona. And so when it came time to go to university in 1956, my family expected me to be a lawyer, and that was their earnest aspiration for me, that our son Richard is going to be a lawyer. And but I ended up in a first-year anthropology class taught by a professor named Robert C. Daly. And I was blown away by how interesting anthropology was. He was, I think, American originally. He was a former U.S. serviceman. The year was 1956. And he had done field work on the west coast of Hudson's Bay at a place called Rankin Inlet with the Inuit. And he was also very interested in physical anthropology and archaeology. So back in those days, there was no real divisions. There weren't the sharp divisions between the four different subfields of anthropology. And so he put it all together in an elegant package. And then it was at that point in first year, I said, I think I want to be an anthropologist. And so that was my formation. Now, an interesting footnote, my wife and partner of 40 years is another anthropologist named Harriet Rosenberg. She's just retired from York University, and her story, she has an interesting biographical account to tell as well. She worked with French peasants as a student of Eric Wolf's. Anyway, when we got together in the 70s, and I said, how did you end up in anthropology? She said, well, in 1964, I was a first-year student at the University of Toronto. I was going to go into history, but then I took this anthropology course with a guy named Robert C. Daly. And she said, wow. She said, wow, this is amazing. And so this was sort of a bond between us, that we had both been inspired by the same lecture, the same professor. Although she later went on to do a joint history in anthropology as a joint degree in anthropology and history. So that's a little diversion. So in my undergraduate days, I loved anthropology, and the way the department operated in those days, the offices of the anthropology department were in the Royal Ontario Museum, where they've been across the road in Sydney Smith Hall since 1964. But in the 50s, that's where they were. And you would need a major gave you a course in linguistics, a course in archaeology, a course in social anthropology, and so on, and physical anthropology. So at that time, we were very much exposed to all the branches of the discipline. I was influenced by several professors in those days. I'll mention them for historical purposes. Ronald Cohen, who is Canadian, who recently retired, I think from the University of Florida, was an Africanist and worked in Nigeria, northern Nigeria. And it was he who inspired me to start thinking about doing field work in Africa, although I ended up in a completely different part of the country, of the continent. Then there was William Dunning, who was a student of Meyer Fortis's and Edmund Leach's from Cambridge. He was also Canadian, and he had done a pioneering study of social and economic change among the northern Ojibwe at a community in the James Bay watershed on the Pic River. It was called Picanticum. And it still exists today, and it's still in the news. But back then in the early 50s, he was doing this pioneering work. And because he was British trained, whereas Cohen was American trained, because he was British trained, kinship was the core of the discipline for him. And so it was with Bill Dunning that I really learned, cut my teeth on the Crow and Omaha kinship systems and so on. A third influence was a professor named James Van Stone, who later went to the Field Museum of Natural History, and I've lost track of him. I hope he's still around, but I don't know. And he did his work on the north slope of Alaska, at villages near where now the big oil deposits are found. But back in the 50s, he was pioneering ethnographer of northern Alaska. And these people, of course, were hunters and gatherers. In Alaska, they were Eskimo, not Inuit. And so it was from him that I first began to get the idea that I could, hunters and gatherers could be an interesting proposition for field work. So this is the next bit is something that might be interesting for for historical purposes, but it's a bit of a revelation. So at the end of my undergraduate days, I said, I want to go to graduate school. And so I went to the professor and founder of the department, T.F. McElraith, quite famous in his own right for a pioneering study of the Bellacoola Indians of northwest coast of BC in the 20s. And I said, Professor McElraith, I'd like to go to graduate school. And he said, well, where were you thinking of applying? And obviously, a letter from him would be absolutely necessary to get me anywhere, I thought. So I said, well, I was thinking of Harvard. And he said, oh, that's very interesting. He said, well, you're Jewish, aren't you? And I said, yes. And he said, well, Harvard's not a very sympathetic environment for Jews. And so, I think you should give that some consideration. I mention that because 5 years later, my first teaching job was at Harvard University. And so, where they seemed to be very comfortable indeed with Jewish professors. One of the famous ones was the psychologist David Reisman, for example, and who wrote The Lonely Crowd. The sociologist, social psychologist David Reisman. And so he said, well, how about the University of Chicago? I said, okay, I'll give that a shot. At that point, I was still pretty open in my interests. So I applied to the University of Chicago, and I was accepted. I thought, oh, this is exciting. I'm going to go to the University of Chicago. And then a family crisis intervened, and unfortunately, I was not able to leave Toronto for 2 more years. So reluctantly, I had to write the University of Chicago and decline. And then I said, well, I'll take my master's degree at the University of Toronto with the same professors that I've been dealing with, even though I was certainly keen to get out of town at that point. The year was 1959 or 60. So I came back for my master's and seemed to do okay. And we would hold our seminars in Professor McElwraith's office, which he had a gorgeous corner office at the Royal Ontario Museum that was maybe 20 by 30 in size, book-lined shelves, and so I have vivid memories of that. And I'm a little bit shaky on short notice on who some of my colleagues were, but so I better hold off on that rather than getting their names wrong. But then the next chapter in my career comes from the fact that this master's was a 4-field master's program. So we did Cree linguistics for one course. Another course we did skeletal anatomy. That was with Jim Anderson, who later went to McMaster, James Anderson. And then we did the history of anthropology with a professor named Fred Voget, who later wrote a major text on the history of anthropology that still, I think it's still in print. And so there was this interesting mix of biology, archaeology, linguistics, social anthropology. And I read an article in the American Anthropologist about primate behavior and the origins of the incest taboo. And it would be difficult for me to recapture what the thesis of the article was, but I read it and I thought, I think I can do better than this article. I was 21 years old. And so I wrote an abstract. I actually wrote a paper, presented it at a seminar, and got favorable response. So I wrote an abstract, and it was accepted at the American Anthropological Association, so then a master's student could dare to go and present a paper at the AAA, and the meetings were in Minneapolis, I remember. So I got up and presented this paper. I think the title was something like The Primate Behavior and the Origin of Incest. And at the end of it, I got a tall young man, not much older than me, came up to me and said, "Hi, I'm Irvin DeVore. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and I'd like you to meet a senior professor named Sherwood L. Washburn. And I think we were really stimulated by the paper that you gave." So I go to the back of the room and I meet Washburn, who was at that time was a very distinguished physical anthropologist, one of the leading figures in the field, and later became the president of the American Anthropological Association. I think his tenure was 64, 65. So I'm nervous, and then I meet him, we're shaking hands, and he says, "Well, Mr. Lee, we heard your paper. We think you're completely wrong. And on the other hand, I see signs of real intelligence there. And I wondered if you'd like to come to Berkeley and do a doctorate with us at the University of California, Berkeley." So I thought, this is wonderful, this is fantastic. And so I was, of course, transported by this opportunity, and told my parents back in Toronto, and so I made the necessary applications and applied to the University of California, Berkeley, was accepted, and started my doctoral research in September of 1961. When I got to Berkeley, I learned quite a bit more about the setup there, and I considered myself a social anthropologist, but Professor Washburn was a biological anthropologist, and Irvin DeVore was somewhat of a combination of the two. And so I learned quickly that Washburn was very interested in, he had done pioneering primatology research. He went to Southeast Asia to study orangutans in gibbons in the 30s, and then made his reputation as an anatomist, talking, and his famous paper, which is still cited, is called The New Physical Anthropology. But with DeVore, they had started a new project, which was to do field studies of primates in the wild. And so the idea was that Richard Lee, the little Jewish guy from Toronto, would go become a primatologist and go to Africa and study some primate. So the fall of my first semester at Berkeley, I agonized about this, and I said, this isn't really the way I want to go. That's not how I see myself as an anthropologist. So another professor there, an archaeologist named J. Desmond Clark, a very distinguished African archaeologist who had just resigned as the director of a museum in Central Africa and became a professor at Berkeley. And when in his seminar, he said, there are so many important projects that I come with a shopping list from Africa. We need to do an excavation here, and we need to do a study there, we need to do, and then about 10th on the list was, he said, we need someone to go out into the Kalahari Desert and see if they can find some Bushmen who were still hunting and gathering and who were still living a more or less traditional way of life. And that, I think, would provide interesting insights for the evolution of human behavior, as long as we exercise certain caution about you can't really make too strong analogies, but there is a rationale there. So with great trepidation, in the fall of my first semester at Berkeley, I went into Washburn's office thinking, oh, I'm going to have to break the news to him that I don't want to be a primatologist. And then, so I came in and said, you know, I really don't see myself as a primatologist, but I really would be interested in doing this study of the Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert. And he said, that's great. That's a great idea. And so we've definitely, you know, that definitely would fit with our program. And that makes perfect sense. So it was at that moment in the fall of 1961 that my career path began to be defined. And so I began to pick up all the literature that I could about hunting and gathering societies, and also what I could pick up about the anthropology of Africa. And so there were an Africanist, William Bascom, who was worked in Nigeria, and he taught me African cultures and societies of Africa. And then there was a distinguished archaeologist named Robert Heiser, who was a specialist in California Indians. And he said, oh, this is great. We'll do a reading course on hunting and gathering societies. And so then he had been a student of A.L. Kroeber's, and he was a great source of information about Kroeber, the heyday of Kroeber in the 20s and 30s, teaching a new generation of anthropologists in what you would call the Boasian tradition in American anthropology. So, and then there was a professor named Robert L. Murphy, who later went to Columbia and had 30 years of successful career at Columbia University, who he and his wife had done a famous study of the Munduruku, who were a agricultural people in the Amazon basin in South America. And so he, even though he was American trained, was very kinship oriented. And so he taught a kinship course for doctoral students. And those were, several of my still very eclectic courses at the University of California. And interestingly enough, this is a footnote worth putting on the record. The year that we took the semester that we did this kinship course with Robert Murphy, a very distinguished British anthropologist named Rodney Needham was taking a year at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and so we invited him to come and address our seminar because he had written major works on kinship. And he was a great disciple of Claude Lévi-Strauss at the time, and at Oxford University. And there's a nice connection here because both Harriet and Andrew Lyons were students of Rodney Needham's. And so since I knew Needham and visited him in later years at Oxford, that was a nice connection for us now Toronto-based people. And so that was the end of, I guess, the first phase of my life from birth till graduate school. And I'd be very happy to continue the narrative in the next session.